Welcome to How to Write Good. I'm your host, Daniel Poppy. You can find out more about me at danielpoppy.com. Poppy is spelled Poppie. On my site, you can find my book, The Ninth Hour, which is a epic fantasy adventure story without magic set in the modern day, essentially. You can also find my serialized novel called One Last Toast for Ebenezer Fleet. You can listen to it or you can read it on my website. Besides that, you can just go to my website, danielpoppy.com. There's a quick video that will pretty much go over what I do and the different things I have going on, so check that out. We're going to jump right into the word of the week. The word of the week is antebellum, and it means something. This is a pretty common word. It means something before a war. So in the United States, we have this we have an era called the antebellum era, which is referring to, it's actually referring to the era before the Civil War. So antebellum era, the era before the Civil War in the United States. Sorry, there's a lot of stuff popping up on my computer, so I'm just getting rid of it so it's not in my way. Besides just that, antebellum, so if you are aware, bella in Latin means war. So there actually is I can't remember what the first one is. I can't remember what the other word is, but there's a Latin quote that is, it's like bella, terra bella, or something like that, and it means war, terrible war, or something to that effect, except I don't know terrible in Latin. So bella means war in Latin, so anytime you're seeing bella in a word, such as antebellum, so bellum is you're not conjugating, you're declining the word, so bellum is kind of like declining the word, but I think that it is I think that war might be feminine because I think it's bella with an A at the end. I'm not positive, but if it's typically a feminine noun if it has an A at the end. There's certain ones that aren't, because every Latin noun has a gender. It either has a masculine or feminine or a neuter gender. I think there's neuter in Latin, if I can remember correctly. I'm almost certain. So I might be wrong about the neuter thing. So you would decline it. The first word, bella, 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 bella. I don't remember exactly how to decline it. It really doesn't change. The singular really doesn't change, but I'm going off. It's beside the point. It's pointless, honestly. All right, so we're going to get into this accidental lessons this week, and this actually is, I'm going to be talking about satire and parody, so humor in general, and I think this is a really interesting one. This goes out to one of the listeners to the podcast. I only know him as Smelly Goat, which I think is kind of funny. So I have to make sure I link him because I want to give him credit for this topic. Because, I had reached out. I sometimes reach out. I'm bad about it, but I try to be like, hey, like you listen or you're connected to me. So I just want to make you aware that I'm always looking for more ideas. So if you have ideas you want me to cover, I'm more than willing to cover ideas if I think I'd be able to do that. They might not be covered right away because I might not know what I think about them yet, but it might, in a couple months, you might see it come up. So I'm going to have him linked into the description. He said, why don't you cover irreverence? And I don't know if I can cover irreverence by itself, but I think satire and parody cover irreverence, and they are very connected. So I think that's something that I'll be able to talk about more intelligently in a way. It makes more sense to me. Irreverence is huge. That's why it's difficult to talk about. But if you talk about satire or parody, it narrows the scope, because you can be irreverent and do it in a humorous way, or you can be irreverent and you can do it in a non-humorous way. So yeah, you can check his stuff out, link to him. My experience is that he's pretty down to earth. That's my experience. So the first question, so if we're dealing with satire and parody is satire isn't necessary. Satire has humor in it, but it isn't necessarily it isn't necessarily the case that they're trying to make someone laugh. So satire is poking fun at somebody, but it's not trying to tell a joke. Well, it is. Okay, let me rephrase that. Satire is trying to tell a joke, but it's more like you're trying to reveal something about what's going on in a society or something like that. So, and parody is typically meant to be something that is just entertain. Satire is more to parody can also entertain, but it's typically the case that satire is more related to politics and different things like that. So when we look at this, these are both, I would say, connected to or embedded within comedy. And I think the first question that we'd want to ask is, why do we like comedy? Why do we even laugh, right? So because you have to start at, I think you always try to go back as far as you can, go back to the bedrock of how these things work. And that's what I try to do on the show. So I think that we have to go back to, why do we like comedy? Why do we laugh specifically? Now, I think that there's a difference between a person laughing and comedy. There are different types of laughing. If you haven't heard, there's something called a pity laugh, where you don't actually think something is funny, but it is a social phenomenon that happens where you don't want to offend the person, but you don't think what they think is funny, but they told a joke, so you kind of just give them a laugh to maintain order or peace between you and this other person, or something like that. Probably a little more complex than that, but the pity laugh. You have the pity laugh, or you have, in some cases, people laugh because they're happy. In some cases, people laugh because they find something funny. Sometimes you have laughter that is like a single chuckle, which I think is different than when somebody is just laughing at something because they find it really funny. You might find something amusing, and amusement is similar to humor. It might be humor, right? It might be the case that you find something funny, and amusement and finding something funny is the exact same thing, or there might be a difference between the two, right? So I think we really need to look at, okay, why do we like comedy and why do we laugh? But specifically, why do we laugh? Why do we laugh in a way that we find something funny? Because, like I said, there's different ways to laugh. Laughter is a really interesting thing people do, if you really think about it. I think it's okay. So a lot of things make sense when people do them. Like if somebody cries, and there's usually a pain in their life of some sort, and it makes sense that somebody cries. If somebody smiles, happiness makes sense as well, right? Or contentment makes sense as well. And I guess that would be connected to needs being satisfied or something good happening. And laughter is something good happening, but it's different. It's not so simple as saying, oh, there was a need fulfilled or there was something good happening. It goes beyond that, I think, and I think that's why we really need to dig into it. And I think that's why it's so interesting and unique in the human experience, and I think it's a good thing. So when I think about laughing, when I think about comedy, I actually go in the opposite direction. I think that you have to think about life in general, because life in general is a very tragic thing in a lot of ways. If you just look at this life right now, if you look at this life, you don't believe there's anything after this life. I think life is very tragic, right? There's a lot of pain. I think most people are dealing with pain and suffering of some kind in their life pretty often. I think there's some people who do have easier lives than others, but I think the majority of people are dealing with some sort of pain, some sort of difficulty, and if they don't deal with it now, they're probably dealing with it at some point in the future. There's injustice in the world. There's situations that don't seem like they're going to get fixed, that are very sad. So you could have someone who continually does something to wreck their own lives. That's going to make them unhappy, but that's going to make other people connected to them unhappy. You can have things like someone dying, either being murdered. You can have other things happen to people that affect. So there's certain crimes that are easier to brush off than others, right? If I get my wallet stolen, I'm not going to be deeply hurt, maybe, right? I might be outraged that somebody stole my wallet, and I'm like, why would somebody ever do this? But I'm not going to be hurt in the same way as if certain other crimes were committed or certain other evil acts were committed toward me or somebody I knew, right? So you can brush certain things off, but other things you can't brush off. So there is difficulty, there's pain. All goes back to pain, right? It all goes back to suffering. I think that's really the problem with the world, or the issue with the world that I think people see is that there's suffering, right? And that they themselves suffer, because then you can empathize and sympathize with other people as they suffer, and then you can see that the world is not a very happy place. The interesting thing is that people actually find happiness despite the suffering, which I think that you should be asking the question, why are those people finding happiness or contentment despite the suffering? Why are people able to accept the suffering and the pain, the injustice, the death that is going on in their lives? So life, if you look at it, if you take a 150-foot view or a 10,000-foot view of life, I think that generally you don't see it as a very happy thing, because what you see is you see a lot of death, you see a lot of destruction, you see wars, you see people who don't have enough food, you see people who are getting killed, people who are getting abused, different things like that. And even if you had a very good society, right? Certain areas of the world are easier to live in than others. Certain areas are richer, so it'll make it easier. Even in societies where there's ease and you don't have all these things happening, or the people don't have to deal with it in the same way. Even in those areas, people still do suffer a lot, right? So you look at this person's life, you see that they suffer a lot, and then they get to the end of their life and they die, and more suffering is produced because they died. So there's a lot of suffering in human life. It's kind of a tragic thing, but it's also very there's a lot of humanity, and the human life and human nature is very special in a way as well, because we do have things like love. We do have connection in a way that no other creature has connection, right? There's connection between two individuals, or between friends that goes beyond what animals feel like. There's community. There's language. Language is a very unique thing, a very special thing, right? I mean, where would we be if we didn't have language? There's things like art. It's a very transcendent, I would say, experience at the same time. So you have these two things butting up against each other, and I don't know. There's I think I've heard people talk about it. They're like, there's this almost divine nature of humans, and there's an animal nature of humans. So think of it like the Christian worldview has this as well. They have that image of God type of thing, and they also have people being made from dirt. So when you look at people, there's this paradox in humanity. There's a paradox in humanity where they're capable of such amazing things while they still suffer greatly, and they are still required to do very basic animal things like eat and go to the bathroom, different things like that, right? So they follow this pattern, but there's so many things that are greater than this pattern. They're greater than what other creatures do. I had a thought, and it just kind of ran away from me. So there's this paradox, and I think that the paradox of humanity is represented well in the comedian, this paradox I just described right here, because comedians are making people laugh. Laughter and what we find humorous is something that is, I think it goes along with that special nature of what it is to be human, but at the same time, so many comedians have issues with mental health. So many comedians are plagued with suffering, which I think is really interesting, and I think that they epitomize in a way what it is like to be human. And I think that we should look at comedians and be like, okay, so a lot of them are suffering, but a lot of them are making other people laugh, so they're finding the humor in life. So let's look to them and see why they're finding the humor in life that allows other people and themselves to laugh. But yeah, you have a lot of comedians who got to the end of their lives, and it was not a happy ending. What was it? was it 2014 when Robin Williams died, which was very sad. I found out about it, and I was shocked. I was like, wow, I can't believe that happened. I was a bit surprised. I mean, he did have bipolar disorder, which makes sense that he killed himself, but he had been alive for like 60 years. So he had been dealing with it for 60 years. He only had 30 more to go. So I was surprised because he was so old. And you also have Chris Farley and how he died, and the just the sadness of that, and that you see there's so much pain. John Belushi had issues as well. Charlie Chaplin, who I think is phenomenal and just hilarious. Charlie Chaplin said, actually, to truly laugh, you must take your pain and play with it. Which, when you look at different comics, really big comics who've been really successful, who've been able to connect to people, many of them, it seems like an above average amount of them have issues, have suffering that they're dealing with, have mental issues, right? And I'm not saying they are psychotic or anything like that. They are, the term, they have a lot of anxiety, a lot of depression, different things like that. And what seems to be the case is the pain, especially when you look at comedians, pain is present with the pleasure, the laughter. But I think if we look at what they're doing, I think we can better understand satire and parody. So we're walking through this. We're going to get to satire and parody. What are comedians doing, right? What are comedians doing? So you have people. Now, I don't think every single person who is a comic is dealing with tons of mental stress, because that's what I would call it, just in the bigger picture. I don't think every single comedian is dealing with mental stress. There's probably ones that aren't. I would say it looks to be the case that most do. And what I think they're doing is the comedians in their own lives, just looking behind the curtain or trying to look behind the curtain, is they've had to deal with mental stress. So they've had to live with this mental stress, and they have to figure out a way to deal, and they have to figure out a way to function in the world with this mental stress. So what do? They make it into a joke. They make it into something productive. I think that Freud would call this sublimation, where you're taking some negative emotion or some urge you have and you're turning it into something, you're creating something out of it. So that's what they're doing, and that goes back to Charlie Chaplin's quote, where if you to truly laugh, you must take your pain and play with it. That is what I think a lot of comedians are doing. They are using their pain. What suffering, I think that's really what we're looking at. What suffering has a tendency to do is it makes certain things very salient, right? And what you have to do when you suffer a lot is you actually have to disconnect yourself from that pain, from that suffering, and you have to start to look at the world. And what I think that this disconnection does is it disassociates you, it disconnects you from that world, because when you think about it, you're over here and you are in a lot of pain, and you're looking out at the world, and you don't see the same amount of pain that you're in. I think that it's generally the case that these people are dealing with more suffering, dealing with more pain than other people. So you have the comedian on this side who's looking out, and the comedian sees the world, but they're seeing it as an outsider, as opposed to someone who's part of that that part of that community. And if you see something as an outsider, you can see it in. Think of it this way: when you are in your own culture, you don't notice all the little cultural idiosyncrasies in your culture. But when you go to another culture, you suddenly notice that they do things differently. You notice the little things even that they do differently. You're like, oh, they all their handles, all the doorknobs are different, all the whatever stuff like that. Oh, certain cultures drive on one side of the road, certain cultures have the steering wheel on a certain side of the car. But it goes beyond that even. If you go around the United States, certain areas of the United States speak differently, and certain areas, even if they don't speak differently, they have certain slang that they use, right? So I'm from the Midwest, and one common Midwestern thing that people say is "ope," which is I think it's a very Norwegian thing to say. I think that's where it comes from. But you notice things like that, and the people who are in that culture don't actually notice those things. They just do it without, that's part of who they are, so they do it without thinking, and then they go on with their lives. And I think that's what is happening to comedians. They've been they are people who are able to disconnect themselves from their pain, and they're able to look at the world, but since you can't disconnect yourself completely from yourself or your pain, but you can separate yourself enough so that you can look at the world and you can start to see, oh, like, how does this world work? What is going on? What are these weird little things people do that make them or make the society itself? And this actually will get into what I'm going to be talking about with humor and constructing jokes and different things as well, because I'm going to go into that as well. But I think that's what comedians are doing. They're disconnecting. They're able to see the world from an outsider's perspective in a way, and they're able to take ideas from that outsider's perspective and they're able to put them into jokes. So when you're creating a joke, and I did some research on this, but the people who are actually doing this as a job, because I'm not a joke. I don't write jokes as a job. It sounds like a fun job, but I don't write jokes as a job. But people who study humor, study why people laugh, and people who have talked about, oh, like, this is how you create a joke. Most people are pointing to the fact that there's two incongruous things that you're putting together, right? Which makes sense. So the comedian himself or herself, whatever, is incongruous. There's two different parts that don't make sense together. There's the laughter, and then there's the pain, right? In most cases, it seems. And then you're also in comedy itself, there's two things that don't seem to go together that are put together, and then because they're unexpected, because you wouldn't expect those two things to be together, people find them funny. Now, I'm not it's still, to a certain degree, it still mystifies me how humor works the way it does. I don't think that the different studies done on it, I don't think they really get to what it is, or why we think things are funny. It might be the case that, oh yeah, they're incongruent, right? Therefore we find them funny, but why do we find incongruent things funny? That's the question. The question isn't, okay, so it might be the case that every single time we find something funny, it's incongruent. But I think that doesn't go down deep enough. It doesn't actually get to the heart of why we find it funny. It just says, oh, this is the category of things we find funny, right? And then we have to be like, why are incongruent things funny? So yeah, so when you're making a joke, or when you're looking at humor, you're leading the audience to assume one thing and you're surprising them with something else. I think they're able to do. I think that comedians are able to do this better, because to live, many of them have to sort through, like I said, incongruity in their own lives, and those topics they deal with. If you look at what I said before, those comedians are able to look at society from an outsider's perspective. They're able to deal with incongruity in their lives, and to be a good comedian, from what comedians have said and what I've read from bigger comedians, they say that you actually have to be able to find something that connects to a larger audience. So there's a difference between jokes between you and your friends, because you have context with those jokes. But if you're trying to connect to someone who you don't know at all, you actually have to have some knowledge of the larger world. You actually have to understand things from a larger perspective. So, which makes a lot of sense for comedians disconnecting from their pain and looking at stuff from an outsider's perspective, because what they have to do is they have to be able to see society, they have to be able to see the context of society, but they also then have to be able to see these little weird things in society that maybe are incongruent with how society works or what society says, or maybe there's a paradox in society, or maybe there is a contradiction in how people work in society. One thing that I find humorous and also annoying is when someone is going 40 miles per hour in a 55 mile per hour zone and in the middle of nowhere, and I'm behind them, and then suddenly we get into a little town and they suddenly stay at like 45 miles per hour, even though the speed limit's 25. I think it's annoying, but it's kind of humorous, because you would think that would flip. You know, you think you'd go faster in the country where there's probably less police officers, which I've found to be the case, where in the middle of nowhere. And you would think you'd go faster in the country, and you'd think you'd go slower in the middle of town where there might be a higher police presence, right? Because there's more people, so they're likely to stick in town, because I just think they're probably likely to stick in town. Maybe I'm wrong. But yeah, so people do that, and that's incongruent, and I think that's weird, and it's kind of humorous. It's also annoying. it's kind of funny that I'm stuck behind a car when I want to go fast as well, if you really think about it. That's a funny image, because there's someone who is in a rush, they're stuck behind a slow car, they're angry, and they're maybe yelling at the slow car, and when you then you zoom in and you look at the person in the slow car, and they're an old woman who just doesn't care, and she's going as fast as she wants. So they're able to look at that from a bigger perspective, and then to actually create comedy that people like, to make jokes that people like, you have to have that bigger perspective. You have to connect to the bigger cultural context, the bigger human experience. Though there were the many things that happened with Bill Cosby, I think one of the reasons why Bill Cosby was so successful as a comedian is he focused on kids. He focused on family life, and that is an extremely broad topic. That's an extremely broad context that he's working within, because pretty much everybody in the United States could understand, that's like, kids do weird stuff. If you ever had a kid and you actually took time to be with your kid and raise your kid, even if you've never had a kid, you realize that little kids do weird stuff. Even kids who are 12 years old, 14, 15, once they get into their teen years, they're still doing weird stuff. So you can pull the humor out of those weird things. So if you're a parent, you have the context of being a parent, which is going to allow you to connect to what he says better. His stuff was very funny. I personally think that it's probably right. It's the world's incongruent, so we laugh at the incongruencies in the world. It just doesn't fit together. And for whatever reason, like I said, it's not the bedrock of why I think we laugh. I think it goes deeper. I just don't know why it's the case. But we laugh because it's incongruent and things are not in sync, right? So what function does comedy serve? And I think this is where we get into this question of satire and parody, right? So what function does comedy serve? I think it definitely relieves tension. Laughter, once you get done with it, you're a lot more relaxed. It relieves stress. So I think that it serves as that purpose. It helps us to not take ourselves as seriously as well. So if you're someone who takes him or herself really seriously, you're probably more stressed out than other people. Because if someone does something that seems to be an affront to you, if you take yourself seriously, it's going to be a higher stressor, right? If you take yourself too seriously, seriousness is being very serious is, I'm not going to say it's like this anxiety-inducing thing, but it is more stressful than laughing, right? Being serious is more stressful than laughing. Besides that, it's definitely a social thing. Laughter is definitely a social thing. I think that it tends to be the case that women like men that can make them laugh. And I think one of the reasons why women like men that can make them laugh is because if a man can make a woman laugh, that man is showing he can navigate social situations. He can pick up, like I said before, to be able to make a good joke, you have to be able to read the context of you have to be able to read the situation you're in. You have to be able to read the room. You have to be able to read the broader context of society. And then you have to be able to craft something, put something together where you're actually, you're relieving somebody. You're reducing their tension. You're making them laugh. So you actually have to be able to navigate things socially to make somebody laugh. And there was some other thing. Oh yeah, this is another part of why I think that women like men who are funny. It brings people together. Like, it helps foster human connection. Especially with guys, is what I've noticed is if two guys enjoy each other's company, they're likely to make fun of each other. And the reason why I think men make fun of each other is because it's a way to break down the barriers, right? Men don't talk about their emotions, and maybe that's a societal thing. Maybe it's just a male thing, right? Maybe it's just something we do, and that's how we function. But they don't talk about their emotions with people they don't know, and they don't even talk about their emotions with people they do know. But at the same time, they will share what's going on in their lives with people they actually trust, right? So they might not say, they might downplay the importance of their emotions, but they might say, yeah, this is really tough and this is what's going on. But you can't actually have that connection unless you know a person. And I think for men, one of the ways they do that is they joke with each other. They tell jokes at each other's expense. And what telling a joke at another's expense is, it shows each person that one, it shows, if you tell a joke at your own expense, it shows that you don't take yourself so seriously. But if you know somebody else and you tell a joke at their expense, and you know the person, you like them to a certain degree, from a guy's perspective, and I don't think women work this way, from a guy's perspective, that's saying, hey, I like you enough to poke fun at you, but I'm not poking fun at you in a way that is getting to the core of some big, huge flaw with you, right? There's a way of joking where you really hit a nerve with somebody and it hurts a lot, and there's a way of joking where you're not trying to cause them pain. You're kind of testing out their limits, and if you can see that they kind of can take a joke, you're probably more likely to trust them. I had another thought with that too that just completely went out of my mind. If you're joking with that, so if I can remember that thought, I'll bring it up, but I can't remember exactly. So I'm going to go over that again. It relieves tension and stress. It helps us not to take ourselves seriously. It brings people together, helps them foster human connection. It's a social thing, definitely a social thing. I mean, any type of art is a social thing, right? So because if you're making art, you want somebody else to experience that art. And maybe you wouldn't classify comedy as art, but it skirts the edges of art. And if you make a joke, you want somebody else to appreciate that joke. It's typically the case that if you make a joke, either you want to laugh at their expense or you want them to laugh because of that joke. One thing too, this is what I was going to say before. So what men do as well is they make a joke at the other person's expense, but it's often the case that even if that joke is made at the other person's expense, the joke is facetious, right? The joke is not to hurt the person. The joke isn't even to point out what's wrong with them. The joke might possibly be to point out something good about that person, right? It might come across as negative, but I think this actually does happen in between friends who are male. I think it's a case that they might make a joke, and the joke might point out something about the person that's like, oh yeah, this is a negative thing, but the joke also could bring to light something about the person that is positive as well. So not in every case, but I think in a lot of cases that's what happens. I think that's what happens. And if you're someone who can take a joke, I definitely think it shows that you don't take yourself as seriously. And I think you're more likable when you don't take yourself as seriously. So satire and parody, or parody and satire is what we're talking about. So with parody and satire, it's specifically used... Now, which one am I on? It's specifically used to shine a spotlight on certain things. Like I said before, and maybe it's changing. Maybe we kind of use them interchangeably. But how I've always understood the difference between satire and parody is satire is more pointed. Parody is more for fun. Satire is more pointed. So Gulliver's Travels is a satire on the governments in Europe, right? Satire on the elitists, the elites and the crown, these princes and kings and queens. And then you have stuff like Blazing Saddles from the 1970s, which is, well, actually Blazing Saddles isn't parody. Or maybe it is. Maybe it is. So you have stuff like Spaceballs, which is still a Mel Brooks movie, I believe. And that is definitely a parody because it is taking another piece of art and it is using that piece of art to make jokes, right? And some of those jokes are at the expense of that piece of art, and some of those jokes are just because certain things are funny. So actually going back to Spaceballs, if you've never seen that, there is the evil Rick Moranis, who is the Honey, I Shrunk the Kids guy, if you don't know him. He plays the evil guy, the evil character in Spaceballs, and his name is Dark Helmet. And if you have ever seen Star Wars, the evil person in Star Wars is called Darth Vader, and Darth Vader is a very imposing figure in Star Wars. He's a very good villain. He's a very good villain. But in Spaceballs, Dark Helmet, I think his name is Dark Helmet, if I can remember correctly. He is very short because Rick Moranis is a short dude, and he has a huge head. So you're taking this menacing character from Star Wars, who is Darth Vader, and you're turning him into this laughable character. One thing for all you millennials, this happened in Harry Potter, where they had that, I can't remember what it's called. You know, it's the ball guard or whatever it is, and they and I think one of the kids put Snape in a dress, right? And he puts Snape in a peacock hat, like an old woman. So that's the same idea. So you're kind of turning something on its head. You're making it ridiculous. But I think satire specifically shines a spotlight. It's typically political, but it could also be cultural. Satire is trying to take something, and it's actually trying to make a bigger point about that thing. And parody is more goofing off. And parody is almost always it's almost always taking another art form and copying that art form in some way. It's following the pattern. It's following after the pattern of that other art form. Like I said, it doesn't have to follow the pattern of that art form. It could be something from society, but it definitely seems to be goofier from my perspective, from how parody is used and what types of parody I see. With both of these, I think that they help us take different perspectives, honestly. We might love Star Wars, but we can find humor in someone poking fun at Star Wars. So if you love something, if you're like, man, this is the best movie in the world, suddenly if somebody starts making fun of that movie, you might be like, oh, no, I don't like that. But if somebody starts making fun of that movie, and if you can see the humor in how they make fun of that movie, you can actually take a different perspective on that movie and see, oh yeah, I understand why this would be funny. I understand why somebody would poke fun at this. I understand why this is a ridiculous aspect of the movie. I think maybe the best thing about Spaceballs, if you've never seen it, is ludicrous speed. That might be my favorite. Or John Candy as a dog. That might be my favorite as well. So yeah, so I think that even in parody, I think we see people allows us to take different perspectives. So it allows us to, so like I said, the comedian is disconnected from the general population, or has disconnected himself from the general population. And maybe what happens in these art forms is we are also disconnected from that general population as we watch it, and we can take this 10,000 foot view of our own society or our own art, and we can see that it is laughable, it is funny, it is incongruent. That's what in Gulliver's Travels, that's the satire that comes to mind. Swift pointed out all these different things that were issues in his society, and I think he maybe found humor in them, but at the same time he was trying to point out these issues, and I think it was a bit more serious, but he was trying to do it in a humorous way. So satire definitely tries to make us take a different perspective, right? Satire is saying, hey, this is either a bad thing in society, or this is something that doesn't make sense in society, and I'm going to actually put it in a different context. I'm actually going to take this thing out of its context, because if we have something in its context, it might feel like it makes sense. Just a quick side note on that. There are certain things, right? The context does matter. The context does matter. In some cases, we get so used to how things work that we need to take them out of that to understand, hey, is this a good or bad thing? We need to look at it from an even broader context. In some cases, the context allows it to be understood the way it is. How would I say that better? In some cases, if you take it out of the context, you're actually looking at it incorrectly. Okay, in some cases it's good, and I think it's more of like we're taking an even broader perspective. But if we just pull something out of context, it might be the case that you view it in a way that is not actually according to how things were. And there's a lot of things that if we take it out of context, that we start to view it differently. One thing that is the case these days is we try to put a modern ethic on people thousands of years ago, when people thought completely different than us. They had a lot of different ideas. They didn't think like us, and we assume, oh, they must have thought like us, therefore they thought this and this and this, therefore they aren't good people. Which they might have not been good people, but looking at them in the context of who they were, we can see, okay, based on the context of who they were, of what context they were in, were their ideas revolutionary? Were they doing things that nobody else was doing? Were they trying to push for ideas that were really good, or were these ideas just part of what their worldview was? Like, for example, if you're in a context that slavery is the norm, and being terrible to your slaves is the norm, and you have a few people in that society who start to say, no, you've got to treat them better, that is doing something that is good for society. Even though we would say, hey, why don't you just free them? Those people might not even think about that because they're in that context. Now, nowadays we'd be like, that's awful, you shouldn't have slaves at all. But in that context, they are working from a space that was different than the space we're working from now, right? They have different ideas than the one we have now. Irreverence, when you're irreverent, because these are, to make comedy, you have to be irreverent, all right? If you are not willing to be irreverent, either toward yourself or something else in the world or somebody else, if you're not willing to be irreverent, I don't think you're going to be able to make comedy. Because now, you might be irreverent towards something that nobody cares about, right? Nobody holds that close to their heart. There might be other things that people take more seriously, like religion or politics, or their mother, right? There's a lot of yo mama jokes. But I think that irreverence is at the core of humor as well, at the core of laughter as well. And I think that irreverence is a chink in an armor that allows us to question what we or others believe. And it goes back to taking a different perspective. Like I said before, it's a chink in the armor that allows us to peek in and be like, oh, maybe what I think is ridiculous, right? Maybe this is ridiculous. Why is this ridiculous? If you can't be irreverent about something in society, some power, it could be cultural, it could be governmental power or something else. It could be the church, right? Government, culture, church. It could be a political party, which is government, or somebody trying to take control of the government. If you cannot be irreverent, one of those groups or a group or a person, maybe it might be an individual person, has set up something that is unquestionable. If you cannot be irreverent, I'll say that again in a different way. If you cannot be irreverent, somebody has essentially said, hey, you are not allowed to look at this from any other context. You are not allowed to disconnect and try to look at this from a bigger perspective than what we've decided is the perspective you can look at, which I don't think is a good thing. I don't think it's a good thing at all, because in the end, you end up coercing people to believe what you believe. If you see jokes about it, if you see jokes about things in a society, that is a very good thing. If you see people pushing, you're probably going to always have people pushing back on the jokes, but I think that's a very good thing. And I'm just going to finish up with this. I think jokes are really important. I think you can make jokes that are mean, right? We all realize that you can poke fun at somebody at the expense of that person. But I think jokes about different things in society are a good thing, because I think that, and I think we've lost it in a lot of ways. I think a lot of people have lost this. I think that a lot of people view, and I think it goes back to how males interact with each other in the larger scheme of things. And I do think they actually do this. I do think men function in this way, even if they've been taught all their life that they're not supposed to. I think they're more likely to do this. I think that this is just part of, I think this is something more a part of the biology of men. This is just part of how they work. I don't know why. I think it's probably due to the fact that they just don't function. They don't deal with emotions well. And it might be the case that men actually are able to disconnect from their emotions better because they're not connected as well with them. And if you're not connected as well with something, you're going to be able to disassociate better. They don't want to deal with their emotions. They're not as capable, right? Maybe that's it. They're not as capable of dealing with those emotions or processing through them or whatever it is. But because they're not capable of doing that, they try to find a workaround. And the workaround is the humor. And in our society, if you have half the population that is not allowed to find humor in certain things, it's not allowed to poke fun at either things they find ridiculous or poke fun in general just out of a good-natured banter, right? If they're not allowed to have good-natured banter between each other or society in general, I think you're going to have issues in that society because you've not allowed... You might disagree with me that this is not a natural thing, or you might say that's not a good thing. I've never found it to be a bad thing. Some of the people I like the best, some of my friends who I like the most are the ones that I joke with the most, and the ones who are willing to poke fun at me, and I'm willing to poke fun at them. I think it's a good thing, but if you're not allowing half the society to function in the way that they function, just how they work. If you're not allowing to process through their emotions in the way that they process through emotions, because maybe they just don't do it the same way women do, right? Maybe they don't talk about stuff. Maybe they have to do it this way. I don't think anybody's ever, I think very few people have thought about that. Some people think, oh, men just need to be more open about what they do. Men just need to do this or that. And I think it's a very feminine pattern to follow. And women are better at it. And I think there is a very big distinction between men and women. There are even brain differences between men and women. Women have a thicker corpus callosum, which is the piece of the brain that connects the two hemispheres. Women have bigger emotional centers of their brain. I think they're denser. I don't know if they're bigger necessarily, but they're denser. And if your brain is denser, that is important. But maybe it's the case that there is such a big divide between the sexes that men and women function differently, and we've been trying to push men into how women function and how women interact, that they aren't as capable of interacting as women because they don't make good women, right? So they need to actually interact. They have to interact how they work, right? They have to interact in a way that is natural toward them, and I think that way of interacting is natural toward them. One part of that, I think, is banter. One part of that is poking fun at one another, poking fun at society in general. I think that's part of it, and I think that there's probably more to it than that. There is a crisis in younger men. There's been spikes in suicide more recently across the board, but specifically with men. Men typically kill themselves more than women. Some people say, oh, women attempt it more, but men actually do it more. So I think that's the bigger issue. Men actually finish it more. I think that's the bigger issue if you actually have people dying versus people not dying. But maybe that's why you have a bigger spike, like this big, huge spike in young men. Maybe it's the fact that we are trying to push them into this box that they don't fit into. And it's just a thought. Right now, it seems to be the case. It seems to be a good thought to me. It seems to be a thought that makes sense for what we're seeing. And maybe we just need to allow them to do what they do in the way that they do it. And it looks like men are more aggressive. Men are more aggressive than women typically. And there's other aspects of masculinity that are different that are not as nice. I've noticed that men in general are not as organized. They don't tend to like niceties as much. All you have to do is go into a girl's apartment who isn't married and go into a guy's apartment. Okay, go into a single girl's apartment, go into a single guy's apartment. And you're probably going to find such a huge statistical difference in how they live in their apartments that it's going to be ridiculous. I've seen guys who they grab couches off the curb, and there's just, the couches are gross, and they chuck them in their apartments. They live there, and girls, they almost always have very nice apartments, and they always have stuff on the walls, and they decorate, and they make it look nice. It's a nice place to be. The guys' apartments are cells. Let's just be honest about that. Which maybe you should make your apartment nicer, but whatever, or get married. So I think that maybe it's the case that this banter is a more masculine thing, and I'm getting off my high horse now, but that's what I've got. So I think that's important for human connection. Congratulations, you got to the end of my podcast. So you either had to listen to my voice, or you had to listen to my voice and watch my face, which I don't envy you. Let's just say that. But if you're someone who likes this podcast and you're thinking, I'd like to support him in this podcast or the other creative things I'm doing, there's a few things you can do, because some people don't know what they can do to support people who create stuff. So these are the few things you can do that will really, really help me. First of all, check out my website. Check out the other things I'm doing. Second, comment on things, share them, like them, subscribe. Subscribe if you haven't already. And the third thing you can do is give reviews on different places, all right? So the biggest thing for this podcast is going on to iTunes, giving it an honest review, telling people why you like it, telling people why you hate my voice, why you hate my face, but telling people why they should really check it out, despite the fact that I have so many failings in terms of looks and voice. Other than that, if you want to check out my books, grab a copy of the book and listen to the serialized novel. Give digital copies away. That's a really big thing too. I always want to give you something that is valuable to you. I always want to give someone listening to this podcast something that's going to stick with them, or a book that they can actually own. And you can own that book for very, very cheap. So go check that out on Amazon. The different things I said: subscribe, upvote, comment, share, and definitely give it a review on iTunes. All right, as always, my name is Daniel Poppy, and this is How to Write Good.